Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services and Minister responsible for Federal Economic Development Agency for Northern Ontario.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, like many members of this House, the people of James Smith Cree First Nation have been on my mind since the horrific and heartbreaking acts of violence on September the 4th. Early that morning, a community already living with the effects of intergenerational trauma faced an unthinkable situation. By the afternoon, the community was left reeling with the deaths of 10 loved ones and 18 others injured from acts of violence that were too terrible to contemplate. No one was left untouched. Each person lost a family member, a father or a mother, aunt or uncle, brother or sister, a friend. And these are their names: Thomas Burns, Carol Burns, Gregory Burns, Lydia Gloria Burns, Bonnie Burns, Earl Burns, Lana Head, Christian Head, Robert Sanderson, and Wesley Pedersen. As the community grieves an unfathomable loss, it has been moving to see the outpouring of compassion from across the country and indeed around the world. In this tight-knit place of only 1,900, everyone is connected. And many people outside of James Smith Cree Nation are too. Friends, colleagues, family from other parts of the country or world have all been left to ask, how could something like this happen? Last week, I went to the community to meet with members and listen to the stories of loved ones. I was honored to attend the funeral of Lydia Gloria Burns, known as Gloria. It was clear that Gloria was a pillar of her community. Indeed, many considered her a dear friend, a person to turn to in times of trouble, and a role model. Gloria was a mother of two, a crisis worker, and a pillar of support. She regularly counseled young people, and she was clearly beloved. She was a first responder, and performing her duty, something so dear to her heart, her life was taken. It's hard to imagine how a community navigates the loss of someone like Gloria. At her funeral, her brother remarked that resilience means walking through anger, walking through pain, walking through grief. The families of James Smith Cree Nation have long suffered from the trauma of colonization, including residential schools. And too often they have not had a reliable or fair partner in the federal government to improve things for the next generations. In meetings with the leaders of this community, we discussed the importance of forgiveness and healing and the equally important role of action to truly walk together. Chief Wally Burns said, "We all have to come together as a community, as Canadians, as a whole." Right now, the community is gripped with burying their dead, helping their injured family members heal, and recovering from the shock of this life-changing event. I've stressed that the federal government will be with them as a strong and reliable partner as they chart a path forward in their healing journey. I go back to the idea of resilience. Of course, we all have to learn to weather the unpredictability of life. But nobody should have to be as resilient as the people of James Smith Cree Nation. We must do better together to help people heal and to see a future that works for everyone. The children of Brian Burns, left behind without their mother, their brother, and the many other children in James Smith Cree Nation facing life without their parent, are depending on us. We owe it to those children and to all of the families suffering to make sense of these tragic losses and to ensure that they have the tools and the supports that they need to heal. Mr. Speaker, I will end on this. The people of James Smith Cree Nation are hurting, but they are also very proud. And they told me they are James Smith Cree Nation strong. I stand with them, and I know this entire House does as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
We are here today to honour the victims of the recent violence in southern Saskatchewan, and particularly the James Smith Cree Nation. 10 lives lost, 18 lives changed forever, a community shattered, and a province and a country in shock. We are here to honour the victims by remembering them, supporting their community in their grief, and by committing ourselves to doing whatever is necessary to make sure this kind of outrage never happens again. No death is solitary. Every death leaves a hole in the hearts of a family and a void in a community. This is especially true in rural and remote regions, where people rely on each other to survive and where so many people are related through blood and marriage. As Mark Arcan, whose sister was among the victims, put it, this is how it is in our community. It's all about relationships. It's all about family. End quote. The violence 2 weeks ago took the lives of mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, aunts and uncles, neighbors, friends, and familiar faces. Each one of them was known and loved. Let us pause to honor them by offering our respect to each of them by name. Bonnie Good Voice Burns, aged 48, a mother, a grandmother, a foster mother who died trying to protect her son, Gregory Johnsy Burns, who was also killed. Lydia Gloria Burns, a first responder who was attacked while responding to a call to help Bonnie and Gregory Burns. Carol Burns, who was visiting her 2 children, one of whom, Thomas Burns, also died. Earl Burns, Sr., a veteran who had already survived an attempted stabbing by the same perpetrator 7 years earlier. Lana Head and her partner Christian Head, who together leave behind 10 children and more grandchildren. Robert Sanderson, a father whose son was also injured in the attack. Wesley Pedersen, a 78-year-old widower from nearby Weldon, Saskatchewan. 10 enormous holes in the James Smith Cree Nation and surrounding communities. As one headline put it, everyone lost someone. Healing takes time. It is a journey. The families and friends left behind have a long journey ahead of them. But I have faith that strength will carry the James Smith Cree Nation through, the same strength that has helped that community survive and work through the immense trauma of history over many years. The reason I have faith and hope is because that while evil is real and strong, faith, hope, and love are stronger. And where we can help, we will. I know the federal government is working with local community leaders, and I note that the minister has been to visit, and I thank her for that. And I offer my party's full support for any government actions that bring healing to the community, especially for the children who have seen what no child should ever see, and for those struggling with mental illness or addiction problems who will find these times especially trying. We can honor the victims and survivors by providing more effective recovery services to more people to help them get out of the cycle of violence and towards hope and healing. That is the least that compassion and respect demand of us. But we must not allow our compassion to tempt us into complacency and stop us from asking the hard questions about our criminal justice system. This tragedy was not a random act of fate. It was the result of a string of failings stretching back more than a decade. The question that Chief Wally Burns asked when he learned about the perpetrator's criminal history should be ringing in the ears of everyone in the House. Quote, why was this guy released when he was so dangerous? I also agree with Brian Burns, whose wife and son were killed, when they said, there needs to be some kind of an inquiry. The families need answers. As a husband and a father, I can only imagine the grief that Brian Burns must be feeling today. I can only imagine the sense of deep betrayal he must feel when he thinks about the callous negligence of our criminal justice system that let this violent criminal out to recommit offenses again and again, not just in this case, but over more than a decade. This perpetrator, who I am deliberately not naming, had been charged with over 120 crimes in 47 cases over the last 14 years. He'd been convicted 59 times. Likely more, but his youth record is sealed. At least 2 of the previous victims those previous victims were also victims of the most recent violence. His in-laws, Earl Burns, who died, and Joyce Burns, who was wounded. The first time, back in 2015, he was charged with attempted murder, but he was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser offense and was only sentenced to 2 years less a day in prison. It has also been reported that he assaulted the mother of his children 5 times between 2011 and 2018. He never received more than a 2-month sentence for any of those assaults. Each time, he was set free to attack again. What happened in northern Saskatchewan 2 weeks ago should be a national wake-up call. The James Smith Cree Nation was the victim of a violent criminal, but also the victim of a broken criminal justice system. We all agree in the possibility of redemption and in rehabilitation. We believe that if someone makes a mistake, does their time, they should have a second chance at being part of society. But when someone commits one violent offense after another, that number in the dozens, at some point, they must stay behind bars for the protection of the public and for the respect of their victims. A system that allows a violent criminal to reoffend over and over again with impunity does not deserve to be called a justice system. Leaving victims vulnerable to repeat attacks by a violent felon is not criminal justice, it is criminal negligence. I agree with Brian Burns. I want to know how this could have happened, and most importantly, I want to know how we can make sure it never happens again. We will not honor the victims and the community if we do not listen to them. We must listen, and then we must act. There must be a top-to-bottom review. We need to know why criminal charges against this violent felon were so often stayed or withdrawn, why the parole boards repeatedly recommended his release despite deeming him a threat, why his sentences were so short even after 3rd and 4th violent convictions. And we need to know why Correctional Services Canada did not deem him sufficiently likely to reoffend even after more than 50 convictions in 14 years, that it failed to recommend against his statutory release. A thorough review is important because the devastation experienced by this community was not an isolated incident. Since 2015, violent crime has increased in Canada by 32%, and the Violent Crime Severity Index is up 18 points. And there were more than 124,000 violent crimes last year than there were in 2015. The violent crime rate is up in all 13 provinces and territories. Clearly, something is wrong and getting worse. We need to know what it is, and we need to fix it. There are no words that can adequately capture the devastation that the James Smith Cree Nation has suffered, and indeed, the pain all Canadians felt at the stories of this unthinkable horror. The stories were of violence, an ongoing manhunt, but also soon after the stories changed and we began to hear stories of the lives of the victims. These were the stories that had been previously filled with laughter, often amid personal struggle, stories of community bound together by bonds of love and support, and now united by grief. Stories of people who are, in Mark Arcan's words, broken but not defeated. Today, we offer our respect to the departed, and for the survivors, in words that can only imperfectly convey sorrow, we offer our sympathy. But if we have only words, then we will have failed the James Cree First Nation again. It is time for these failures to end. It is time for our words to transform into actions. And it's time for all of us to rally in support of this wonderful community and its beautiful members as they heal and recover from these terrible events. Thank you.
L'honorable député d'Avignon-Lamitis-Matane-Matapédian.
Moi, sur une note plus sombre, j'aimerais offrir au nom de tous les élus du Bloc québécois mes plus sincères condoléances aux proches ainsi qu'aux victimes de l'immonde tuerie qui a eu lieu au début du mois de septembre sur le territoire de la nation Jaime Smith, dans le village de Weldon. 10 personnes tuées, 18 blessées et toute une communauté qui souffre et qui entame un long processus de guérison. Nos pensées vont également aux membres de cette communauté, en cette période où les mots « vérité » et « réconciliation » ravivent souvent de douloureux souvenirs. Je ne saurais mieux exprimer toute la compassion et la sympathie qu'un événement traumatisant tel que celui-ci demande. Seulement voilà, les mots et les souhaits ne sont pas suffisants. En tant qu'élus, nous avons le devoir de veiller à ce que des événements comme celui-ci ne se reproduisent jamais. À ce titre, plusieurs questions entourant cette tragédie ont été soulevées au cours des dernières semaines et elles exigent des réponses. J'espère sincèrement que cette Chambre aura la sagesse et la détermination de les trouver sans ligne partisane, sans arrière-pensée et au bénéfice des communautés autochtones et des populations qu'on représente. D'abord, nous avons appris quelques heures après l'arrestation de l'un des 2 suspects de cette tuerie que l'un d'eux était un récidiviste et qu'il avait violé ses conditions de libération. Je cite le quotidien La Presse dans un article du 7 septembre dernier, et vous me permettrez de taire le nom de l'individu. En novembre dernier, le suspect avait violé ses conditions de libération. En février, la Commission des libérations conditionnelles, dans sa décision de le garder en liberté, avait estimé qu'il ne représentait pas un risque excessif pour la société après avoir purgé les 2 tiers de sa peine. Celui qui avait été condamné à pas moins de 59 accusations pénales, notamment pour agression, agression armée, agression à l'égard d'un policier et vol, ne représentait pas un risque pour la société, selon la Commission des libérations conditionnelles. Un palmarès peu enviable qui nous amène à nous poser certaines questions quant à sa libération. Une des questions qui mérite d'être posée est certainement celle-ci. Jusqu'à combien d'accusations pénales la Commission des libérations conditionnelles en viendrait-elle à la conclusion qu'une personne représente un risque pour la société? On ne me méprenne pas ici, je respecte l'institution qu'est la Commission des libérations conditionnelles. Une telle organisation est essentielle pour la sécurité des citoyennes et des citoyens. Et pour avoir discuté avec des agents, je comprends que les moyens qui sont à leur disposition ne sont pas toujours optimaux. En fait, ils sont souvent loin de l'être. Ça apparaît comme un non-sens quand on comprend l'impact que peut avoir une décision telle que celle de libérer un délinquant plus tôt peut avoir dans la société. Et dans ce cas-ci, c'est plutôt difficile de ne pas soulever certaines interrogations en sachant que c'est l'un des 2 suspects, ce que l'un des 2 suspects avait comme libellé dans son casier judiciaire. Parmi ces interrogations, il est tout à fait normal à la vue de cet événement de se demander si le suivi des détenus et leur réhabilitation se font avec l'accompagnement et les moyens nécessaires. Je sais que pour un agent, cela représente énormément de travail et d'éléments quelquefois difficiles à prouver pour convaincre la commission qu'un délinquant pourrait effectivement représenter un risque pour la société, particulièrement à un moment où les agents sont en situation de surcharge de travail. Peut-être en sommes-nous à l'heure d'une réforme de l'institution. Nous pourrions suggérer au comité parlementaire de la sécurité publique et nationale de s'y pencher et de déterminer si utilement il y aurait des ajustements nécessaires. Bien sûr, on sait que le ministre de la Sécurité publique a rendu public en juin dernier le cadre fédéral visant à réduire la récidive, et je tiens à le souligner. En revanche, comme il s'agit de la première étape du gouvernement dans l'élaboration d'un plan qui cerne les facteurs déterminants qui influent sur les motifs de récidive et sur la façon d'appuyer la réinsertion sociale sécuritaire et réussie, et compte tenu des récents événements dans la nation Jaime Smith, il serait de bon ton que le comité s'y penche davantage, n'est-ce que pour peaufiner le dit cadre. On peut aussi s'interroger sur les services en santé mentale qui sont offerts aux individus qui sont particulièrement connus du milieu policier, comme c'était le cas pour le suspect de la tragédie. C'est d'ailleurs l'une des suggestions du Bureau de l'enquêteur correctionnel qui, dans son 48e rapport, a recommandé à Services correctionnels Canada de mettre au point une méthode fiable sur le plan administratif pour faire le suivi des personnes ayant des problèmes de santé mentale. Monsieur le Président, un événement effroyable, horrifiant, inqualifiable tel que celui-ci nous impose des moments de réflexion qui vont aussi au-delà du milieu carcéral. Qu'est-ce qui peut expliquer que 2 individus puissent s'en prendre à autant de gens en si peu de temps avec un tel présumé sang-froid? Est-ce que nous devrions nous inspirer d'autres juridictions qui font mieux que les instances fédérales concernées? N'aurions-nous pas intérêt à ce moment-ci à nous inspirer de la Norvège, qui présente le taux de récidive le plus faible au monde, à 16 %? Peut-être pourrions-nous nous inspirer davantage du Québec, qui, selon une étude de 2019 du Centre interuniversitaire de recherche en analyse des organisations, a, et je cite, des programmes visant à faciliter la réinsertion sociale des détenus qui fréquentent les prisons gérées par le gouvernement du Québec, qui diminuent la récidive, mais qui, en plus, le font nettement mieux qu'ailleurs dans le monde. Monsieur le Président, avec tout le respect et toute la sympathie que nous devons aux personnes touchées, l'heure est également à la prise de conscience et surtout aux propositions et aux solutions. Le gouvernement peut évidemment compter sur le Bloc québécois pour trouver des pistes d'atterrissage communes, bien documentées et qui permettent à nos populations de vivre en toute sécurité. J'espère sincèrement que cet appel à la collaboration sera entendu, accepté et qu'il mènera à des discussions franches, nécessaires et au bénéfice de tous un chacun. Parce qu'on peut bien parler d'un événement isolé qui n'arrive que très rarement si on en a envie, tout en s'en lavant les mains, en passant au prochain appel, en faisant semblant de rien, en se cachant les yeux pour ne pas voir l'horreur. Mais je crois, en toute sincérité, que nous avons l'obligation morale de dire aux gens que nous représentons, et particulièrement aux gens de la communauté James Smith, plus jamais. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Nunavut.
Today, we recognize and mourn the loss of the victims of the James Smith Cree Nation, the tragedy that occurred September 4th, 2022. My thoughts are with the many others wounded and the community that has been wounded by this event. The impacts of intergenerational trauma continue to be exposed through such acts of violence. My thoughts are with the community of James Smith Cree Nation and how strong they are and how strong they are forced to be right now. Healing is the path forward, and that cannot be done without recognizing that the ongoing process of colonialism has shaped this tragedy. We need to make sure this tragedy does not go unrecognized by this government. This shows that true reconciliation is still necessary for our communities to move forward. We must begin the conversation that discussing the prevention of intergenerational trauma going forward. The impact of the tragedy is felt throughout Canada, and as a country, we mourn the loss of the persons who are no longer with us. I would like to acknowledge the victims and families of the Saskatchewan stabbings who lost their lives. Thomas Burns, Carol Burns, Gregory Burns, Lydia Gloria Burns, Bonnie Burns, Earl Burns, Lana Head, Christian Head, Robert Sanderson, and Wesley Peterson. We as a country must ask for more to be done to support these individuals and their families who are victims of crime and ongoing impact this will have on the families and friends within the community. We must recognize the impact of colonialism and the aftermath related to the criminal justice system's impact on these communities. The New Democrats will fight to ensure these families get the supports they deserve. As parliamentarians, we must ensure that reconciliation is forged with investing in the well-being of Indigenous peoples. We must be the parliamentarians that focused our efforts on recognizing the strengths that Indigenous peoples must realize in themselves. We must be the parliamentarians that invested in reconciliation to ensure that tragedies such as these, as what happened in James Cree Nation, does not happen again. We must ensure that we honor the memory of the victims and their families never happen again, and that we must ensure that we do our best to talk about reconciliation in terms of justice, in terms of healing, and in terms of making sure that we are the ones that ensured real reconciliation with Indigenous peoples so that we could see Indigenous peoples contributing to society in a positive and proud Canada that we must see and realize is so important. We must be the parliamentarians that focus on the strengths of what we see in Indigenous peoples. Koyanami.
I believe the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands, rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to request of my dear colleagues unanimous consent to allow Green Party to put some words on the record about this dreadful tragedy.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to acknowledge that today, as on every day in this place, we stand on the territories of the Algonquin Nation and express to them our gratitude. Miigwech. I also want to express gratitude, and this may be somewhat unusual for starting this morning, but I can't say another word without expressing my deep gratitude to the Conservative caucus for allowing me to speak. And I then extend my congratulations to the new leader of the official opposition. Some of you who pay close attention to this place may know, and not to complain, but it's been since the 2021 election that Greens have been allowed to speak in moments of tribute and sadness. And I'm deeply grateful to the honourable member for Carleton for this change in policy. I appreciate it enormously. And I also want to say that every word that's been spoken here is something with which I think we can all agree. I want to thank the honourable member and Minister for Indigenous Services, the new leader of the official opposition, my friend from Avignon, Le Métis, Matane, Matapedia, for her words, and to the honourable member for Nunavut. There's not, I think, one of us whose heart is not broken. I thought about taking off my black ribbon of mourning for Her Majesty the Queen this morning, and I thought, no, I'm still in mourning. Yes, Her Majesty the Queen has parted this earth, but so have members of the James Smith Cree Nation, 10 people, much loved in their communities, much loved by their families, who are no longer with us and who died in horrific circumstances. So I will leave on my ribbon of mourning for today, at least, for the James Smith Cree Nation, the families of the victims, and the families of the perpetrators, all of whom are in a period of deep suffering. There's much that has been said, and I will not trespass on your time long. Just to say, there must be more than words. We speak words in this place of reconciliation, of a cry for justice, of a prayer for healing, and that we will do better. In this circumstance, I think what we must do is what I'm so grateful to so many Canadians, because in the words of so many members of James Smith Cree Nation, they express gratitude and almost surprise how many Canadians are grieving with them. We grieve together. That is the very root word of compassion, to suffer together, compassion. We share it across Indigenous settler cultures. We grieve together. Just as in another horrific circumstance, we grieved with the people of Nova Scotia in Port-au-Pic. I think we need to look to all the calls that I've heard across the room today for inquiry, for consideration. What better must we do? That James Smith Cree Nation is saying maybe we'd be better off if we had Indigenous police services. The chiefs in Manitoba are saying the same thing, where they don't feel secure that in a situation like this, they have the policing that's needed to protect people. The fact that Gloria and others who were first responders and raced into the scene, Bonnie and others, that circumstance of dying while protecting your family should not occur. We should have the police services that are needed and at the ready. And local, in my view, may be a solution that's better, whether it's Portapique or James Smith Cree Nation. We need to examine policing, and we need to examine, as the Honourable Leader for the Official Opposition has said, release procedures when people are dangerous and should not be released in the population. I won't prescribe solutions at this point. I think we need to commit to listen and investigate, and particularly support the people of James Smith Cree First Nation and other places that are still wounded and suffering from events of violence. We can do better. We must do better. And to everybody touched by the tragedy at James Smith Cree First Nation, we send our prayers, our love, our words, and we also say clearly, we know words are not enough. We will do more, we will do better, but we're with you, and particularly with your dear children, as they process things no child should ever see and no family should ever experience. Thank you again for your time. Miigwech.
The honourable member for Sydney Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, our hearts are heavy today as we mourn the tragedy that occurred on and around the James Smith Cree First Nations on September 2nd. A tight-knit Cree community has lost beloved community members, elders, youth, brothers, sisters, mothers. Mr. Speaker, today I stand to remember and offer condolences to the 11 victims and their family members. We mourn as a country the victims from the Burns, Sanderson, Head, and Patterson families. As a First Nations MP who lives on a First Nations reserve, I can only imagine the grief, pain, and overwhelming sense of loss that the community is going through. As a government, we will work with Indigenous leadership to ensure adequate resources to help heal and to help keep Indigenous communities safe in the future. I know the strength and the resilience of First Nations in Canada, but I want the community to know that you're not alone. We are thinking of you, we are praying for you, and we will do what is necessary to help you.